Good morning. We are continuing in our discussion of Jewish history. We had talked about a little bit about the scene in Europe with the emancipation, Enlightenment. We're talking time periods here, 1700s, 1800s, okay? So that's the time parameter, 1700s, 1800s. Europe is undergoing tremendous change. And the Jewish people, in some cases, are at the forefront of that change. Jewish communities in England, in Germany, and in France are increasingly a part of what is going on in leadership in those countries. There are Jewish people who are prominent in education, in banking, in commerce, and increasingly in government. And so that precipitates what is now known as Reform Judaism. Again, Reform Judaism is going to be the first instance where there is a wholesale bolting away to the left. Here's the left. They go to the liberal left, and they discard many of the traditions and many of the rules and regulations of the Torah. Basically, they are saying in each generation, according to the originators of Reform Judaism, Judaism needs to reform. And so they don't like to say reformed, ED, as in the past tense. They always use the term, it's Reform Judaism. It's a currently ongoing process of reformation each generation. It needs to reinvent itself. In the early years, Reform Judaism sprung up first in England and Germany and France, in these Western countries that had really grabbed a hold of the Enlightenment and of democratic movements. And Jewish people were often, as I said, had their ear to the ground to try to understand whether that coming down the road at them was going to be good. Did they have to move to the right, to the left? Did they have to get out of town? And so all of these were very real things. While at the same time, the situation in Eastern Europe had not changed all that much. Eastern Europe is divided among, religiously, either among Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy. There are certain countries like Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia. I was there last year to do a series of teachings. Hungary. These are Catholic countries. Poland is divided. Portions of Poland are Eastern Orthodox. Others are Roman Catholic. Wherever Jewish people were, however, they were always subject to that idea that you are the discarded remnant of God's displeasure, and your very existence is simply a testimony that God has discarded you. They are more viewed as a lesson to be learned, as a warning not to get out of the will of God. Of course, the people who held that view in Christendom were not reading their entire Bible, but rather they had imported wholesale the early Roman Catholic theology of replacement. There were exceptions, but they were few and far between. Well, Reform Judaism makes the jump of the pond and comes to America, and it becomes a very fast-growing movement in America. So at this point, things are changing rapidly. There were time periods in Jewish history where for 200 years, there was not a whole lot of movement. There were people who were writing, yes, there was some local activity, but nothing like what we're going to see in the 1800s. Things are changing rapidly. Each decade, there are dramatic changes, not only that affect the Jewish people, but also regarding the political situation in Europe. So we're going to hear talk in Roman numeral 22 about the late 19th century, that's the late 1800s, and the beginnings of Zionism. We had talked about the rise of European nationalism. The French Revolution was an early adopter. The French Revolution in the late 1700s, the throwing off of the monarchy, and the fall of monarchies all throughout Europe, like dominoes, one by one by one, monarchies were collapsing, and parliaments and attempts at democracy or at republics were increasingly in vogue. One of the components of this whole movement was a nationalism. It is the rise of European nationalism, and it was new to them. Don't confuse this phrase, new anti-Semitism, with a phrase that's just been used in the last 20 years. I have a friend, Olivier Melnick, who has written a book on the new anti-Semitism, and he's talking about the last 15 to 20 years, because anti-Semitism is taking a different form, often driven by misinformation by media. But here you have an earlier iteration of that, because when you have the rise of peoples against monarchies, the people groups who arise against monarchies have something that unites them. What unites them? It is a common national identity. And so in places like Hungary, there were attempts to push out people who were not of the original Magyar tribe, the original Hungarian tribe, were pushed out. So in this wave of throwing off monarchy, they realized that monarchies would often meet in a back room and move around people groups throughout Europe like pieces on a chessboard. You'll take this group, I'll take that group, I'll enlarge my territory, you'll enlarge your territory. They were backroom deals that were often the results of wars. But now people are asserting themselves and saying, no, we are not like these folks. We've seen the result of artificial couplings in our own generation. For instance, something that I saw firsthand was the country of Czechoslovakia, which is no longer Czechoslovakia. All growing up, all during the years that I grew up, it was this country, Czechoslovakia, under the thumb of the Soviet Union. And so what's this word Czechoslovakia? It's two different countries, two different nationalities, the Czechs and the Slovaks. I didn't drive, Ivan drove. He was one of our students here for many years, and we had spoken in a conference in the Czech Republic, and then we were driving to his home in Budapest, Hungary. We drove through the Czech Republic and through Slovakia. When you go from one country to another in the European Union, there are no border guards. You don't pass through a checkpoint. Instead, there is just simply a kind of greeting post above the road or the side, say, "Welcome to Slovakia." And all the signs changed. The appearance of the towns changed. I don't want to get into it beyond that, but it is a different place. And increasingly, people are rising up and saying, we want to unite with the people who speak our language, who have our customs, and we want to coalesce our country. And when they looked around, they said, but what are those Jews doing here? This is our country. We are Poles, or we are Hungarians, or we are this group or that group. So with the rise of European nationalism, the throwing off of monarchies, you have a new anti-Semitism. This new anti-Semitism is given understand the word, pseudo-scientific validity by books that would start to come out by anti-Semitic writers. They would concoct elaborate and nonsensical theories talking about the superiority of one race over another. What scientific theory is arising at this point in time in the 1870s? Anyone? Darwinism is arising. And with the rise of Darwinism, you get the impression that somehow there may possibly be certain groups that are more advanced in intellect, in abilities than other groups, because that is one of the byproducts of Darwinism, of this whole theory that's long since even been shot through with holes in many of the scientific. There are people who are not believers, who are not embracers of religion, that have degrees in hard sciences that point out the many impossibilities of Darwinian evolution. They're not fully ready to embrace creationism. They're kind of someplace in the middle. They're searching. And so Darwinism fuels the idea that some races are inferior. And this is something that is very quickly applied to anyone that you don't like. So if you don't like the Roma people, the Gypsy people living in your midst, you will apply this theory to them. If you don't like Jews, you will apply the theory to them and concoct a nonsensical sort of justification, a modern enlightened justification. Of course, it's not enlightened at all, but for your anti-Semitism. And there is a whole grouping of books that come out in Germany in the 1880s and 1890s that push forward this theory of the racial superiority of one group over another. And so this starts to take root in Western Europe, especially in Germany and several of the Western European countries, leading to this new anti-Semitism. The Jewish population in places like Germany and France was very assimilated. Please understand that by the 1880s, 1890s, once again, there were Jews serving in the military, serving as military officers. There were Jews who were firmly ensconced into all high places in both France and in Germany. But again, as we said yesterday, they viewed themselves first as either Germans or Frenchmen and as Jews secondarily. They had hoped that that self-identification would make, it would be like Teflon for anti-Semitism, that anti-Semitism wouldn't stick to them because they would primarily be seen as Germans or Frenchmen. And so there's no reason for anti-Semitism. Hence, Reform Judaism adopts the idea that there is no such thing as the Jewish ethnic group. There is no Jewish race for you to be a racial bigot toward. There is a Jewish religion. Who are the practitioners of a Jewish religion? They would point to very successful, very westernized Jewish people in Germany and France and in England who were very successful, who wore topcoats, who wore, the hats that were fashionable at the time, looked like proper English gentlemen of the 1890s, ate at the finest restaurants. And so that was an attempt. The idea was, if we can just convince all of those poor Jews around the world to adopt the same sort of attitude, anti-Semitism will disappear within 2 generations. Yet at the same time, in Eastern Europe, we've just talked about Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, religion and the bigotries of the replacement version of Christendom continue to reign strongly. Pogroms. Text is a little bit cut off over there, but in Eastern Europe, there are pogroms that sweep through. The word pogrom is a Russian word that means a violent shaking up. And from the 1600s, from the mid-1600s, all the way, in essence, through 1946, there are violent pogroms that sweep through. Oftentimes, these pogroms were centered around, guess which holiday? The holiday of Easter. The idea is that during the Holy Week, there are rituals in certain communities associated with Christendom where they would be talking about the observance of the death of Jesus. And there is a whole mourning that they go through, and in certain Eastern European countries, it's very visceral, it's very emotional. People process through the streets, and this Holy Week is a time of mourning, especially in some of the Eastern Orthodox communities, and they would be whipped up to a frenzy on occasion by either Eastern Orthodox clergy or Roman Catholic priests who would say, and who did this to our Lord? And the refrain would be, the Jews killed Jesus. The Jews killed Christ. I believe in your notes, in the appendix section, there is something that I heartily recommend that you download. If it's not there, I will... No, I'm not sure if it may be in your copy. We're using an older copy of this outline. But there's a booklet written by our good friend, Dr. Michael Rydelnik. And the booklet is simply entitled, They Called Me Christ Killer. They Called Me Christ Killer. It's actually published by Radio Bible Class, which is an evangelical association within our circles. And in that book, Michael, who is the son of Holocaust survivors, in this he traces the history of anti-Semitism around the cry, the Jews killed Jesus, so now we're going to kill the Jews. And he accurately points out that this has been one of the most effective wedges at keeping the Jewish people from Jesus. These pogroms were mostly in Eastern Europe. They were in Russia. They were in Poland, and they were in my grandmother's town in the Ukraine. More about that in just a bit. The whole idea was to remind Jewish people that they were very subservient and that there was this growing nationalism. So let's illustrate this in a way that's all too familiar to my family. This is a photograph taken in 1912 of the village of Felshtin in the Ukraine. This happens to be a meeting of religious Zionists. So in the front you have people with talitot, with or as we used to say in Brooklyn, with talisim. They're wearing prayer shawls. They are in front of the wooden complex of buildings that served as the synagogue. Felshtin is a city in the southwestern part of the Ukraine, not far from the border of Moldova. And this is the ancestral home of my father's mother, the Siegel family. This is where they lived. My grandmother, as a young girl, was hidden during the years 1903 to 1906 because Ukrainian villagers would rampage through the town seeking to rape and destroy. Between the years 1903 to 1906 in the Ukraine, in some other sections of Eastern Europe, but most especially in Moldova, there were large-scale violent pogroms that killed thousands upon thousands of people. And there were children who were hidden. Whole communities were deserted with people going into hiding. And again, what they looked at were neighbors who they may have in previous years encountered in the market on Thursday. They're looking upon neighbors who are now whipped up to a frenzy by false theology being taught in some of the nationalistic Ukrainian and Eastern Orthodox churches especially. And there is a version of Roman Catholicism in those countries that is different from Western Roman Catholicism. It has a very different sort of mix, very different sort of culture. And what they all have shared is a long history of violent anti-Semitism. Taught this course, I think it was 5 years ago, and there was a fellow who was Ukrainian national. He was in complete and total denial that this ever happened. From the beginning of the course to the end of the course. He just preferred to believe nonsensical things that he had been told. Sometimes truth can fall, and this is history. There are photographs. There are actually old movie reels of people being treated in the aftermath. But this is a continuing issue. And to this very day, where there is often a reluctance in some of these countries to acknowledge the part they played in genocide. But it was very, very real. And again, it was the theology of the mother's milk of anti-Semitism. This was being taught from the time young children were going to catechism class, that the Jews were somehow responsible for the death of Jesus. So therefore, anything that you do to them that in normal society would be considered sinful is somehow acceptable. In Arab countries, this sort of brainwashing is still being practiced upon children. Now, however, you can just click on YouTube. 2 clicks will take you to all sorts of indoctrination classes where in certain areas, young Arab children are being brainwashed to desire to grow up to kill Jews. They don't say kill Israelis, they don't say kill Zionists, they say kill Jews. So this whole facade that, no, we're not anti-Semites, we're just anti-Zionist, that's fraudulent. That is simply a facade to hide an age-old anti-Semitism. So, my grandmother's village in the Ukraine, her parents wisely put her on a boat, sent her off to New York as a girl in her mid-teens to live with her older brothers. Her older brothers had come to New York previously. They were doing well. They had all set up steam laundries. And for a while, the biggest steam laundry in Sullivan County, New York, was operated by my grandmother's older brothers. So in 1908, she's 15 or 16 or so, she sails to America. She is safe. The town goes on. 1912, there are stirrings of Zionism. There are people hearing about the increased activity in Eretz Yisrael. Let's go back to the land. What do we have here? We never know when there's going to be a pogrom. That's why I encourage you to watch the movie Fiddler on the Roof, because always they had their ear to the ground. What are they saying in Moscow? What are they saying in Kiev? What do you hear? What's the revolution? There are violent political acts left and right. One of the things you'll see in that movie is obviously it centers around the daughters, and Tevye the milkman wants to see his daughters married off to wealthy, educated, pious individuals. And there's a whole set of misadventures that happens. Of course, one of the heroes of the movie is Mottel, I'll have you remember, who winds up marrying the oldest daughter. But the second daughter is taken with this young Jewish man who is a radical socialist. And he says, we're going to go to Moscow or Kiev, and we're going to march and show the Tsar that we're... Was he from? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. The font of pop culture is right here. And so this young man is Jewish, and so the father is kind of a little leery because he's wearing a hat, but he's not wearing tzitzit. You'll notice in the movie that Mottel is wearing tzitzit, but this young man is not wearing tzitzit. He's not religious. He doesn't really care about kashrut and the customs, and he wins the heart of the second daughter, and they go off. Why? Because he's about to join the revolution in 1905 that is trying to overthrow the Tsar of Russia. It failed, and thousands of Jewish people were slaughtered, along with tens of thousands of ordinary Russians. One of the misnomers, one of the pieces of misinformation that floats around is that somehow there is a link between communism and Judaism. It's not true. The vast majority of the Bolsheviks were not Jews. They were Gentiles who had grown up in churches. Again, the vast majority of the early Bolshevik communists were Gentiles. My father was a card-carrying member of the Socialist Workers' Party. He adored people like Trotsky. These were his heroes. He read the books in English translation before he also came to faith, after I did. And so this is a misnomer, that somehow there was some natural affinity. The only thing that was happening was that Jews were oppressed. They sought redress from their oppression. The Tsar had an iron thumb and did whatever he wanted and oppressed everyone. So Jews organized and tried to join with others of like mind to overthrow the Tsar. In 1905, it failed, and it was disastrous for many Jewish communities, which caused further emigration. So in 1912, they're thinking about leaving, and they have this meeting. We don't know the exact content of this. The inscription underneath is in Yiddish, and it is a meeting essentially of religious Zionists. They're meeting there. 1917, this is now snowballing, and this is the synagogue in Felshtin. This is my grandmother's synagogue in which her parents worshipped, which she worshipped as a young child. They're in the front of this wooden synagogue in Felshtin, and in 1917, look at the front row, whose picture are they holding? Theodor Herzl. He now had become the poster boy of the Zionist movement, and rightly so, very understandably. And some men here are wearing talisim, and they are, maybe this is after a meeting. It's unusual that they would be wearing a talis. Was it Shabbat? Probably not, because there's a camera. But then again, some of the rules about what you do on Shabbat and don't do are actually very recent. They may have not had a problem. So in 1917, they're having a Zionist meeting. We need to plan to go back to the land. Things are getting worse. There's a revolution. The Bolsheviks are trying to overthrow the Tsar, and they're trying to hold on to the Ukraine. But the Ukrainian nationalists hate the Tsar and they hate Jews, and the Cossacks are coming in and riding through town just like they did in Fiddler on the Roof. And so in 1917, in my grandmother's village of Felshtin, people were planning to leave. My grandmother had been married the year before, in 1916, in Brooklyn, and was already starting a family. Did she have a way of communicating with her parents who were still there in Felshtin? We don't know. But she and her brothers were safely